And covered in glitter.
As always. Well met, Internet. Before we get started today, I would like to give a shout out to @TiaTheBard and @LARPHouse for retweeting my last video. Thank you ladies so much for supporting my channel, it means the world to me. And if you would like a Twitter shout out, make sure you go over and follow me on Twitter and give my videos a retweet when they come out. This week I was a little bit stumped for what to talk about. I didn't want to continue on the heavy note that we had last week, so I decided to ask you all for questions on Twitter and Instagram about my job. My husband and I run a company called Closet Champion that makes primarily lucha masks now, but has made pro wrestling gear for people all over the world for the past 4 years. I'm just gonna go right into it with a question I got on Twitter, actually from Tia the Bard. Tia asked, how did you get started with it? How long have you been into wrestling? My mom says I was born with a needle in my hand. I started embroidering when I was quite small under her instruction and through the instruction of like American Girl books. I started making clothes when I was around 10 or 11. I used to sell sewing machines. I worked at a bridal shop. I was one of the costumers for the Pennsylvania Renaissance Fair. I never went to school for it. My mom didn't go to school for it. I'm taught by my mother and YouTube and Craftster.org tutorials, really. So I've been sewing my whole life, but wrestling didn't come into my life until I was about 18. And I'm gonna tell you more about the sort of inciting incident for my path. This show and this experience deserves its own video. My first show in Detroit was Squared Circle Review, and it was a burlesque wrestling show, and I played music on that show. And my husband was performing wrestling on the show, and I had never really been into wrestling. But basically, I went to that show, I saw what independent wrestling was, and I was like, this is different, this is a different thing. I didn't know that it could look like this. My husband is a high-flying luchador performer. He really pulled out all the stops that night, and I was just dumbfounded by the athleticism and the storytelling. I had no idea what I was missing. Honestly, what began my personal love for wrestling was Botchamania. I loved Botchamania. I loved wrestling being able to sort of make fun of itself in this way, and the fans being able to make fun of it, because it made it so much more approachable. When I started dating my husband, I ended up going to independent wrestling shows all the time, specifically Chikara, and I started to really fall in love with the grand theatrical aspects of wrestling. The thing that really draws me to it is that it's everybody in the show, like everybody in wrestling, including the fans, is playing a game of improv. Like we're all sort of yes-anding each other about whatever is happening. Yeah, that's how I got into it. I was sewing my whole life, and then I married a wrestler, and my wrestler needed things, so I made him stuff. And then eventually other people started asking me to make things too, and I started making them things too. That's how I got into it. I started sewing wrestling gear around 2013. Next question. The podcast about nothing asks, what's the most expensive material you use or have used? The most expensive material I've ever used is probably not what you would think it is. Most of the materials I work with are between $8 and $20 a yard. Realistically, wrestling gear is not meant to last forever. There will be a time when you have to retire it if you want those high metallic finishes. And if people are gonna have to just get the same thing in 6 months or whatever, I try not to use too expensive materials. But the most expensive material I've ever used was a custom printed spandex for a company that asked me to make wrestling gear for one of their corporate events. Next question is, it's from Ghost Von Dracula. Are your creations mostly made by sewing machine, or is hand stitching a larger aspect? Most of my work is made by sewing machine. I do some rare hand sewing on occasion when I'm attaching a button and whatnot. Sewing spandex has a lot of different aspects to it, so whilst I may not be sewing things physically by hand, my brain and my body are constantly working when I'm making wrestling gear, because spandex changes shape every time you touch a sewing machine to it. Spandex isn't just knowing how to work with the material, which changes based on dye lot and type of metallic coating. It's also understanding your machine and what your machine might need in order to make the process easier. Does your tension need to be adjusted? Does your presser foot pressure need to be adjusted? Would changing the stitch width and length make this particular project easier? Is the bobbin case on the proper tension? A lot of different things that you have to kind of think of while you're using the machine. It's not just, oh, I cut out the pieces and I put the fabric through the machine. Sometimes when I sew with regular non-stretch materials, it feels like going on vacation. It's the closest thing to a vacation I'll ever get. I'm working until I die. A more specific question came from referee Larry Peace. What went into the thought process for Riley Shepard's gear? I love her ring attire. Thank you so much, Larry. For those of you who don't know, Riley is an independent wrestler based locally in this area, and she came to me and asked for elven armor, and I said, this is what I was meant to make, and I made her some elven armor. Literally, she sent me one reference image, a cosplay of a character that I didn't recognize, and she said, I want something like this to wear under my leather ring gear. So I said, okay, I'll make you something that fits under that leather ring gear, but will look good on its own. So yeah, that was the thought process. I wanted to make cool gear for a nice lady. There are 3 questions on Instagram that are kind of the same question, which is, what's the best costume you've ever made? What's your favorite gear you've made so far? And what's your favorite thing to make? I'm gonna kind of keep these all in the same. So my favorite thing to make is probably boot wings. That's really like my passion project is like my fairy costume stuff. I like any kind of like fairy fantasy project that people allow me to work on, like any kind of big crazy coat, or I like big weird projects. But I also like little easy to complete projects like boot wings, where I'm like, okay, I just make this one thing in this one way. And what's the best costume I've ever made / my favorite gear that I've made so far? I think the best costume I've ever made is the gear I made for Princess Kimberly when she won the Chikara Grand Championship at the end of 2015. She really allowed me to play with the design, and I think that she looks exactly like what she's supposed to. She looks like a wrestling princess. And then to have that moment be so publicized was really awesome, because that gear got in Rolling Stone and got all sorts of press coverage. That's probably my favorite set of gear that I've ever made. The last question is, did you have all the skills you needed from your experience with costumes, or were there new things to learn? There was a lot to learn when it came to wrestling. I had to learn how to fit men's bodies. I had to learn how to work with stretch materials. I had to learn how to work with foam and vinyl. They were not things necessarily that I had done before. Really, wrestling gear kind of dragged me kicking and screaming into it. I said I was never gonna make wrestling gear ever again the first time I made it. Obviously, I run a wrestling gear business now, so like there was a turning point. As my mom likes to say, I come from the done is good school of costuming, and I just brought that into wrestling gear with me, and I figured as long as I get it done and it works, then it's fine, and if it doesn't work, then I'll come up with something new. So far, there are very few projects that have completely stumped me. My husband and I worked really hard to cobble together this life that we have, and we kind of fill in the spaces of each other's gaps in knowledge when it comes to the business. He helps me know more about the wrestling side, and I help him know more about the sewing side. And with that combined knowledge, we've able to build this thing. I had to learn a lot in order to get here, and I'm still learning more every day, but you know, I'm surviving. That's crazy. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I had such a good time answering your questions. Feel free to ask me questions whenever. They may inspire a future video or end up in a Q&A just like this. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe if you believe, and I will see you all next week. Cuyando!